From Mercury to Saturn V, one nation turned a line of weapons into the machines that reached the moon, and the last of them has never been beaten. The Saturn V put out 7.5 million pounds of thrust, stood taller than the Statue of Liberty, and remains the most powerful rocket ever flown successfully. But it was tested in the most reckless way any rocket ever has, and by the end, you'll understand why that gamble was the only reason America made it to the moon on time. I cross-checked the specs and flight records of all 14 vehicles in this program against more than 20 sources to build this. Every one of these rockets carried something priceless: a satellite, a reputation, or a human life, on top of hardware first designed to level cities. You'd assume NASA built its spacecraft from scratch. It didn't. Almost every rocket here started as a missile aimed at another country, and the one that broke that rule became the most powerful flying machine ever built. On December 6, 1957, the United States had a plan to answer Sputnik. It was called Vanguard, and the whole country watched it live on television. The rocket climbed about 4 feet off the pad at Cape Canaveral, settled back down, and erupted into a fireball. The papers called it Kaputnik, but the Navy's Vanguard was never America's only shot. Down in Huntsville, Alabama, a German engineer named Werner von Braun had spent years quietly asking for a chance. His team had been brought to the United States in 1945, and the rocket they had built for the Army, the Redstone, was a direct descendant of the V-2 that once fell on London. Its turbopumps, its tanks, German war technology, rebuilt on American soil. And here's where the names start to matter, because the Redstone became 3 different rockets, and almost everyone blurs them together. The Redstone on its own was a weapon, a single liquid stage, 75,000 pounds of thrust, built to fly a warhead about 200 miles. Stretch its tanks, swap the fuel for a harsher blend called Hydine, and stack 2 clusters of solid Sargent motors on top, and it becomes the Jupiter C, a 3-stage sounding rocket that only ever flew suborbital tests. Add 1 more solid motor as a 4th stage, and now it can reach orbit. That final version had a name of its own, Juno I, and there's a strange detail that's just hiding in that 4th stage. It sat tucked inside the nose cone of the 3rd. If engineers had fueled it too early, that spinning nose cone would have overshot its target and reached orbit all on its own, carrying nothing. So, they held its ignition until the exact right moment. The difference between launching a satellite and launching an empty cone came down to timing. So when the Army was finally told to try, they were ready. On January 31, 1958, a Juno I lifted off and placed Explorer 1 into orbit, America's first satellite, all 30 pounds of it. It carried an instrument that discovered the radiation belts wrapping the Earth. The nation that had blown up 4 feet off the pad was suddenly in space. But a satellite is one thing. The Redstone family had proven it could reach space, and that raised a far bigger question. Could the same rocket that lofted 30 pounds of metal carry a living human being? The answer was yes, but only for 15 minutes. And that 15-minute limit nearly handed the entire space race to the Soviets. But that ceiling came at a price. The Mercury Redstone could only manage a suborbital hop, a 15-minute arc up to about 116 miles and back down. It could not orbit. And on April 12, 1961, that limitation became a national embarrassment, because a Soviet named Yuri Gagarin didn't just reach space, he circled the entire planet in 108 minutes. America's answer came 23 days later, and it lasted a quarter of an hour. Before it could fly a man, though, the Redstone had to be tamed. Von Braun's team made roughly 800 changes to the tactical missile to make it safe enough for a human. They stretched the fuel tank by 6 feet for a longer burn, bolted an escape tower to the nose, and wired in an automatic abort system to yank the astronaut clear if anything went wrong. The rocket was von Braun's. The capsule riding on top was a separate machine designed by Max Fagay. Two different teams, one stack, and the first attempt to prove it was almost comic. On November 21st, 1960, the countdown reached 0. The engine lit, and the rocket rose 4 inches off the pad before shutting itself down and settling back onto its base. A power plug had disconnected 29 milliseconds too early. The engine quit, but the escape tower didn't get the message. It fired off on its own, and the parachutes flopped out on top of the rocket, sitting quietly on the pad. They called it the 4-inch flight. But they fixed it. On May 5, 1961, Alan Shepard sat strapped inside Freedom 7 through hours of delays, long enough that he asked to relieve himself, was told no, and eventually did, right there in the suit. When he'd had enough of waiting, he famously demanded they stop the problems and light this candle. 15 minutes and 28 seconds later, he became the first American in space. He'd flown higher and faster than any American before him, but he'd only touched space, not circled the planet. The second flight nearly turned tragic. On July 21, 1961, Gus Grissom's Liberty Bell 7 splashed down and its hatch blew open early. The capsule flooded and sank. Grissom barely escaped drowning. He always insisted he never touched the trigger, and NASA cleared him. Decades later, enhanced footage backed him up, static electricity, not human error. Quietly, other rockets called Little Joe were flinging test capsules skyward to prove the escape system worked. But all of this, every fix, every flight, ran into one wall. No matter how much you modified it, the Redstone would never reach orbit. For that, America needed something far more powerful and far more terrifying to ride: the Atlas. To truly orbit, NASA turned to a rocket that terrified its own engineers, the Atlas. It wasn't built as a spacecraft at all. It was an intercontinental ballistic missile designed to carry a nuclear warhead to another continent. And its record was chilling. Of its first 10 launches as an ICBM, 6 failed. Now, NASA wanted to put a man on top of one. But the Atlas offered something the Redstone never could, nearly 5 times the thrust, enough to reach true orbit. To make it safe for humans, the Mercury variant, the Atlas L-53B, got reinforced tanks, had its military hardware stripped out, and received upgraded engines. Even so, it remained a strange beast to fly. Because the Atlas hid a secret that sounds impossible. Its stainless steel skin was just 0.33 millimeters thick, thinner than a coin. On its own, it couldn't even stand up. The rocket held its shape only because its tanks were pressurized from within, like a rigid balloon. Without that pressure, the whole structure crumpled under its own weight. Unpressurized, you could dent it with your hand. America was about to launch a man into orbit inside a steel balloon. Its architecture was just as odd. It lit 3 engines on the ground, 2 boosters and a central sustainer, but partway up it dropped only the 2 boosters and kept climbing on the sustainer alone. Engineers called it stage and a half, not 1 stage, not 2, something in between that nobody ever copied again. And then on February 20th, 1962, John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth aboard Friendship 7, 3 laps around the planet in nearly 5 hours. But during the flight, a telemetry signal warned that his heat shield might be loose. If it was true, Glenn would burn alive on re-entry. Mission Control made a desperate call: don't jettison the retro rocket pack, hoping it would hold the shield in place. As he re-entered, Glenn watched flaming chunks streak past his window. "That's a real fireball outside," he radioed. The shield held. The alarm had been false, a faulty sensor. The heat shield was never loose at all. Glenn wasn't the last. After him came Scott Carpenter, Wally Schirra, and finally Gordon Cooper, who in May 1963 closed out the Mercury program with the longest American flight yet. 22.5 orbits, more than 34 hours in space. Mercury had proven an American could orbit alone, but the moon demanded things a one-man capsule could never do: fly in pairs, step out into the vacuum, and dock with another ship. That would take a new rocket, and a capsule built for two. Before it could walk on the moon, America had to learn three things it had never done: meet another craft in orbit, dock with it, and step out into the vacuum. Mercury could teach none of them, so NASA built a bridge program, Gemini, and to launch it chose, once again, a repurposed nuclear missile, the Titan II. But the Titan II GLV was not the military missile. The Gemini version had its war hardware stripped out and new systems added to protect two men. And it burned something special: hypergolic fuel, a blend so poisonous and corrosive it could kill anyone who touched it. In return, it offered a brutal advantage. Its two components ignited on their own the instant they met, with no spark, no igniter. For an emergency abort, that meant absolute reliability. NASA accepted the poison in exchange for that certainty. There was, however, one problem that could kill the crew all by itself. The Titan II suffered a vibration called pogo. The rocket bounced along its own axis as if riding a giant spring, shaken by instability in the fuel flow. It was so violent it would have incapacitated the astronauts before they reached orbit. So engineers fitted damping chambers and pressurized tubes that absorbed the oscillation, pulling it down to a level a human body could withstand. Only then was the Titan fit to fly men. And what Gemini achieved changed the race. To practice docking, NASA launched a target vehicle separately, the Agena, on an Atlas rocket. It carried no crew, just a target waiting in orbit. On March 16, 1966, Neil Armstrong pulled off the first docking in history with one of them. And then everything went wrong. A thruster stuck open and the docked craft began spinning faster and faster until the crew was nearly blacking out. Armstrong shut down the entire system, switched on the re-entry thrusters, and burning 3/4 of his fuel, stopped the spin. He saved his life and his partner's with a composure that 3 years later would make him the first man on the moon. It wasn't the only milestone. Ed White had taken America's spacewalk. Another crew endured 14 days in orbit, and Buzz Aldrin closed the program by finally mastering the work outside the ship. When Gemini ended in 1966, the United States had at last overtaken the Soviet Union in accumulated time and space. But all of this was still happening a couple hundred miles from home. The moon was 1,000 times farther, and reaching it demanded a leap in scale that bordered on madness, and one man willing to bet on it. Up to now, every rocket in this story had begun as a weapon. The Saturn broke that rule. It was the first American rocket designed from scratch for space, with no military past. But the way von Braun chose to build it made half of America write it off before it ever left the ground. Instead of waiting years for a giant new engine, von Braun clustered 8 H-1 engines, inherited from the Redstone and Jupiter, into a single first stage. The wisdom of the day called it insane. The more engines you bolted together, the greater the odds that one would fail and take the whole rocket with it. Critics mockingly dubbed it Cluster's Last Stand, but von Braun bet on the pragmatic shortcut, and on October 27, 1961, the first Saturn I lifted off without a fault. Across 10 flights, those 8 engines never blew. The cluster worked. The Saturn I did the heavy lifting of rehearsal. It tested dummy Apollo capsules and launched the huge Pegasus satellites, which measured micrometeorite impacts. But its true heir was an upgraded version, the Saturn IB. And here it pays not to mix them up because they're different rockets. The 1B kept the 8 engines, now more powerful, but added a new second stage on top called the S4B. That stage was the future. It burned liquid hydrogen, a fuel far more energetic than kerosene, but fiendishly hard to handle, kept at hundreds of degrees below zero. Mastering it was essential, because without liquid hydrogen there was no reaching the moon. And here's the detail that makes it matter even more. That very same S4B stage would end up bolted, almost unchanged, onto the top of the giant still to come. The Saturn IB carried this era's most human moments. On January 27, 1967, a flash fire on the pad killed the 3 astronauts of Apollo 1, Grissom, White, and Chaffee, during a ground test. The program stopped dead, and it was a Saturn IB that, 21 months later, returned America to space. On October 11, 1968, Apollo 7 finally carried a crew to orbit and reopened the road. That same rocket would later launch the crews of Skylab, and in 1975 end its career with the historic handshake between Americans and Soviets aboard Apollo-Soyuz. 19 flights between the two Saturns, and not one failed. The cluster, the hydrogen, the upper stage, all of it had worked. But all of it was still the rehearsal. For the moon, they had to multiply everything by 10, with an engine so brutal that at first it shook itself to pieces. And so we reached the machine that changed everything. The Saturn V stood 110 meters tall, higher than the Statue of Liberty, weighed nearly 3,000 tons, and unleashed 7.5 million pounds of thrust. 3 miles away, the shockwave from liftoff struck spectators in the chest. The ground shook and the roar arrived before the sight of it. Nothing ever built by human hands had done anything like it. It was 3 stages stacked together. The first, the SIC, burned kerosene through 5 F1 engines. The second, the S2, switched to liquid hydrogen with 5 J2 engines. And the third was the S-B, the very same stage already flying on the Saturn IB, now crowning the giant for the final push to the moon. But getting here nearly ended in disaster. The heart of the rocket, the F1 engine, refused to behave. In tests, its combustion chamber suffered oscillations so violent they tore the engine apart. Engineers had to redesign the injectors and add baffles until the motor learned to damp its own shaking. And there was one more scare. In April 1968, the uncrewed Apollo 6 flight was rattled by a longitudinal vibration, a pogo, different from the one that plagued the Titan, that actually shut down 2 engines on the second stage. The fix was to inject helium gas into the fuel lines to cushion the shock. Only then did they dare put humans on top. And here is the gamble that defines this whole story. The traditional safe path was to test each stage separately across successive flights, but a NASA director named George Mueller refused. There was no time. Kennedy had promised the moon before the decade was out. So Mueller ordered something that horrified half the team, von Braun included. Test all 3 complete, working stages on the very first flight. Bet everything at once. If a single stage failed, the entire rocket was lost. They called it all-up testing. And in November 1967, on its debut, Apollo 4 worked flawlessly. That reckless bet was, quite literally, the only reason America reached the moon on time. From there, the giant never faltered. In December 1968, Apollo 8 carried the first humans to orbit the moon. In July 1969, Apollo 11 set them down upon it, and in 1972, Apollo 17 closed out the lunar era. Only one Saturn V never flew to the moon. In 1973, in a rare 2-stage configuration called INT-21, it launched the Skylab space station. When Apollo 13 nearly became a tragedy, the rocket was not to blame. An oxygen tank failed in the service module, long after the Saturn V had done its job. And that is the verdict that crowns everything. The Saturn V flew 13 times and never lost a crew or failed catastrophically on a crewed mission. More than half a century after its final flight, it remains the most powerful rocket ever flown successfully in all of history. The impossible bet had paid off. Stop for a second and measure how far this went. In November 1960, an American rocket rose 4 inches off the pad and shut itself down. 12 years later, a 3,000-ton machine was tearing 12 men off the Earth and sending them to walk on the moon. 4 inches to 250,000 miles in a little over a decade. There is no other leap like it in the history of engineering. And to make this journey complete, 2 pieces worked in the shadows. Before any astronaut climbed aboard a Redstone or a Saturn, other rockets tested their way out. The ones called Little Joe launched the escape towers of the Mercury capsules again and again, proving they could yank a man off a rocket about to fail. And its successor, the Little Joe that's 2, did exactly the same for the Apollo capsules, firing them clear in mid-flight to verify the escape system would work the day it was needed. They never carried a human being, but they may have saved several. It's worth being clear, too, about what this journey didn't cover. This was the story of the rockets that carried people from Mercury to Saturn V. The launchers that lofted satellites with no crew, the Scout, the Thor Delta, the uncrewed versions of the Atlas Agena, are an entire lineage of their own, with their own history of triumphs and failures. That one deserves its own telling. Because knowing the rockets is only half the story. You've seen the machines that tore 12 men off the Earth, but not what happened once the engines went quiet and they were alone, coasting toward the moon. Every Apollo mission had a drama of its own. The first Earthrise ever seen by human eyes over another world. The impossible landings, the explosion that turned a routine flight into a fight to survive. The Saturn V only got them there. What they did next is where it gets good. Watch it now in every US Apollo mission explained. The complete history. And find out what happened when these rockets finally let go of their payload in the silence of space.